My mother handed me a bill at Thanksgiving dinner, not a request, not a suggestion, a printed bill, itemized, size $83, utilities for the day, a line at the bottom that said hosting fee $144, $312 due. She slid it across the table like I was a customer who had overstayed my welcome. I folded it in half, put it in my purse, and said nothing. What my mother did not know, what none of them knew, was that the house we were sitting in, the table we were eating at, the mortgage attached to every wall and window of that property was in my name. Had been for 3 years, they were billing the landlord for dinner. Before I continue, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And hit like and subscribe if you've ever been made to feel like a stranger in your own family. My name is Paige Bennett. I am 32 years old. I grew up in a 4-bedroom brick house on Ellsworth Lane in Lake Forest, Illinois, the kind of street where every lawn is edged on Saturdays and every car in the driveway is leased, not owned. From the outside, we looked like a family that had figured things out. Inside, we had a system. It just took me 20 years to understand what the system actually was. My mother, Diane Bennett, ran the household the way a general runs a campaign, with absolute clarity about who mattered and who was there to serve. My brother Troy was 35. My sister Cheryl was 37. I was the youngest. And from the time I was old enough to notice, I understood that the three of us occupied different categories in my mother's mind. Troy and Cheryl were investments. I was overhead. It was not always dramatic. That is what made it hard to name for so long. It was quiet, subtle. The kind of thing that does not leave bruises but leaves something else. A low-grade certainty that you are somehow less than the people sitting next to you at the dinner table. Troy got the car for his 16th birthday. I got a bus pass and a lecture about the value of public transportation. Cheryl's college application essays were proofread by my mother at the kitchen table, 3 drafts, late into the night. When I applied to the University of Illinois, I typed my essays alone in my room and did not tell anyone until I had already been accepted. I studied architecture. My mother thought it was impractical. Troy had gone into finance, a real field, she said once. Not quietly enough, and Cheryl had married a man named Doug, who sold commercial insurance and owned a boat. These were the benchmarks. These were the proof points of a life well constructed. I was building floor plans and reading load-bearing calculations and learning how to look at a structure and understand exactly what was holding it up. My mother looked at that and saw someone who drew pictures for a living. My grandmother Ruth was different. Ruth Bennett was my father's mother, and she was the kind of woman who noticed everything and said very little about what she noticed. She was 78 when I graduated college, small and sharp-eyed. With white hair she kept pinned back and a habit of watching people the way a card player watches a table. She came to my graduation, my mother did not. Diane said she had a prior commitment. I never asked what it was. Ruth sat in the 3rd row and afterward took me to dinner at a restaurant with white tablecloths and ordered a bottle of wine and said, "You're going to be just fine, Paige. Don't let this family shrink you." I did not know then what she had already done. Ruth passed away 3 years ago in November, 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. She was 81. The service was small. She had wanted it that way. I flew in from Chicago and sat in the front row next to my father, who was gray-faced and quiet in the way men get when they lose their mothers. Diane sat beside him and cried in a way that seemed more performed than felt. Troy and Cheryl took turns shaking hands with people they did not know. I sat there and thought about the dinner with white tablecloths and the bottle of wine, and the way Ruth had looked at me when she said what she said. After the service, a man named Gerald Okafor introduced himself to me outside the funeral home. He was Ruth's attorney. He said he would be in touch within the week. He gave me his card. I put it in my coat pocket and forgot about it until I found it doing laundry 4 days later. I called him from my apartment in Chicago on a Tuesday morning in December. He was precise and unhurried in the way that lawyers who have delivered complicated news many times tend to be. He told me that Ruth had established a revocable living trust in my name when I was 19 years old. He told me the trust had become irrevocable upon her death. He told me I was the sole beneficiary. Then he paused, and I remember looking out my kitchen window at the parking lot below, and he told me what the primary asset of the trust was. The house on Ellsworth Lane. I asked him to repeat it. He did. I sat down on my kitchen floor, not dramatically, just because my legs decided they were done, and I listened to Gerald Okafor explain, in careful and precise language, that my grandmother had transferred the property into the trust 13 years ago. That the mortgage, refinanced in 2019, was in my name. That Diane Bennett had never held title to the property. That she had been living in a house that belonged to her granddaughter-in-law for over a decade without knowing it. Because Ruth had handled the paperwork through Gerald's firm and had never seen fit to mention it to anyone. Did my father know? I asked. No. Gerald said, Did my mother ever ask? There was a small pause. Your grandmother said that your mother had never shown interest in the legal documents. She signed where she was asked to sign and did not read what she was signing. I stayed on the kitchen floor for a while after we hung up. Outside, a garbage truck was making its rounds. A pigeon landed on the windowsill and looked at me and left. I thought about every Thanksgiving, every Christmas Eve, every Easter Sunday when Diane had set the table with the good china and presided over the meal like a queen holding court, and I had sat at the far end near the kitchen door and eaten quietly and driven home in the dark. I thought about the bus pass. I did not call my mother. I did not call Troy. I did not call Cheryl. I made myself a second cup of coffee, got up off the floor, and went to work. Some things do not need to be said right away. Some things are better carried quietly for a while, until the moment when they need to be said at all is chosen by you and no one else. I was in no hurry. Easter came 4 months after I got off the phone with Gerald Okafor. I had not told anyone what I knew. I had gone back to Chicago, taken on 2 new commercial projects, and spent my evenings reading through the trust documents that Gerald had couriered to my apartment in a manila envelope thick enough to use as a doorstop. I read every page. I am an architect. I read documents the way other people read novels, looking for the load-bearing lines, the places where everything either holds or falls apart. The trust was clean, airtight. Ruth had been thorough in the way that people are thorough when they have been planning something for a very long time. I drove up to Lake Forest on Easter Saturday. The drive is about 40 minutes from the city, north on I-94, through the kind of landscape that shifts gradually from industrial to suburban to the particular green quiet of the North Shore. I had made this drive hundreds of times. I knew every exit. I knew the way the light changes when you get close to the lake, how the air smells different, cooler, with that faint mineral edge that comes off the water. I pulled into the driveway on Ellsworth Lane at 11:30 and sat in my car for a moment before going in. The house looked the same. Red brick, white shutters, the oak tree in the front yard that Ruth had planted the year my father was born. The gutters needed cleaning. I noticed that the way I always notice things, not with feeling, just with the part of my brain that catalogs and files. I got out of the car and went inside. The house smelled like ham and something sweet brown sugar and cloves. Diane was in the kitchen in a linen apron, moving between the stove and the counter with the brisk efficiency of a woman who wanted everyone to see how much effort she was putting in. Troy was in the living room with a drink, talking to Doug about something involving interest rates. Cheryl was setting the table with the good china, the set that had been Ruth's, the one with the thin gold rim that Diane had claimed immediately after the funeral and installed in her own cabinet without asking anyone. I said hello. I poured myself a glass of water. I sat at the kitchen island and watched my mother cook. You look tired, Diane said, not looking up from the stove. I'm fine, I said. Are you sleeping? Yes, you work too much. She said it the way she always said it. Not with concern, but with a faint undercurrent of satisfaction, as though my working too much was evidence of some fundamental disorder in my character that she had always suspected. Dinner was at 2. We sat down, Diane at the head, my father at the other end, Troy and Cheryl on one side, Doug and me on the other. The ham was good. The conversation was the usual rotation. Troy's firm, Cheryl's kitchen renovation, Doug's boat, which had apparently been repainted and renamed. I ate and listened and contributed when I was asked a direct question, and did not say anything that was not required of me. We were on dessert, a lemon cake Cheryl had brought from a bakery in Winnetka, when Diane set down her fork and folded her hands on the table. I recognized the gesture. It meant she had prepared something. I want to talk about household contributions, she said. The table went quiet in the specific way that tables go quiet when someone says a thing that everyone knew was coming, but no one wanted to be the one to start. This house costs money to maintain, she continued. Utilities, upkeep, the cost of hosting. Your father and I are not getting any younger, and it's not reasonable to expect us to carry these expenses alone when we have adult children who are perfectly capable of contributing. Troy nodded slowly, the nod of a man who had been briefed in advance. Troy and Cheryl have already agreed to a monthly contribution, Diane said. She named a figure, $200 each. Then she looked at me. We think it's fair for you to match that. Starting next month, I looked at her. I looked at Troy, who was examining his dessert fork. I looked at Cheryl, who gave me a small, tight smile that was not really a smile. And if I don't? I asked. My voice was even. I was genuinely curious. Diane's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes shifted, a flicker of something between irritation and pleasure. Then, honestly, Paige, I'm not sure what your place here is. We're a family. Families support each other. If you can't do that, then perhaps the holiday gatherings aren't the right fit for you. Troy set his fork down. It's not a big ass, Paige, it really isn't, Cheryl said. Doug said nothing. He was looking at the tablecloth. Doug had always been the smartest person in the room, by virtue of knowing when to stay out of things. I looked at my mother for a long moment. I thought about Gerald Okafor's voice on the phone, precise and unhurried. I thought about the trust document, page 47, the paragraph that described the property in full, the lot dimensions, the assessed value, the legal description that ended with the name of the sole beneficiary. I thought about Ruth, sitting in the third row at my graduation, sharp-eyed and watchful, who had seen something in this family 13 years before this moment and had made a decision accordingly. I took my napkin from my lap and placed it on the table beside my plate. Okay, I said. That was all I said. One word. Diane blinked. She had expected either an argument or an immediate capitulation, and I had given her neither. I pushed back my chair, thanked her for dinner, said goodbye to my father, and walked out through the front door. I sat in my car in the driveway for 3 minutes. The oak tree Ruth had planted was just starting to come back after the winter, small pale green leaves at the ends of the branches, tentative and new. I looked at it for a while, then I backed out of the driveway, turned onto Ellsworth Lane, and drove back to Chicago. I did not cry. I did not call anyone. I turned on the radio and listened to a woman talk about the weather for the next 7 days, and somewhere around the Edens Expressway, I made a decision that I had probably been edging toward for longer than I realized. I was going to let this play out. I was going to let them walk all the way to the end of the road they were building, and then I was going to be there when they got there. I have a small apartment in the West Loop, on the 14th floor of a building that was a meatpacking warehouse in a previous life. The ceilings are high and the windows are original industrial steel, the kind that tilt open on a hinge and let in a particular quality of Chicago air, cold and particulate in winter, warm and almost sweet in summer. I had found the place 3 years ago and renovated it myself, or as close to myself as building codes allow. I designed the shelving. I chose the concrete finish for the kitchen counters. I knew the load capacity of every wall. It was the first space in my life that was entirely mine, and I understood, in the weeks after Easter, why that had always mattered more to me than I had let myself admit. The Monday after Easter dinner, I called Gerald Okafor. He answered on the second ring, which suggested he had been expecting to hear from me at some point and had perhaps been wondering what was taking so long. I want to understand the full picture, I said. Everything. Not just what's in the documents, what my grandmother intended, what she anticipated. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Why don't you come in?" His office was in the Loop, 12 minutes from my apartment on the Blue Line. I went on a Wednesday afternoon, between a site visit and a client call. His office was on the 19th floor of a building on Wacker, with a view of the river that turned silver in the afternoon light. He was a compact man in his late 60s, with close-cropped gray hair and the careful stillness of someone who had spent 40 years listening to people in distress and had learned not to absorb it. He made coffee. He sat down across from me. He opened a file folder. "Your grandmother came to me first in 2009, he said. Paige was 12 at the time. He corrected himself without embarrassment. He had used my name in the third person for a moment, the way lawyers do when they have been working with a file long enough that the person in it becomes a kind of abstraction. "You were 12. She was concerned about certain dynamics in the family. She did not go into detail about the specifics. She said she wanted to make sure that one particular person was protected, and that the protection needed to be structured in a way that could not be easily discovered or challenged. She planned this when I was 12, I said. She began planning when you were 12, he said. She refined it over the years. The trust was formally established when you turned 19. The property transfer was completed in 2013, when the previous mortgage was paid off. The 2019 refinance was done through my office. You signed the documents yourself, do you recall?" I did recall. I had been 26. Gerald had sent me a package of documents by courier. I had signed where indicated and couriered them back. I had assumed at the time it was some kind of administrative maintenance on the estate. I had not read carefully enough. I had not yet learned to read everything. I signed a mortgage in my own name and did not understand what I was signing, I said. You signed correctly, Gerald said. The error, if we're calling it that, was in not asking questions. Your grandmother anticipated that you might not, she said. He glanced at his notes. She said that you had a tendency to trust that things would work out and not to look too hard at the machinery. She found it endearing. She also found it something to plan around. I sat with that for a moment. Outside, a river taxi moved slowly down the Chicago River, bright blue against the gray water. What does my mother think she owns? I asked. Nothing formal, Gerald said. There is no document anywhere with Diane Bennett's name on it in relation to that property. She has been a resident, a long-term resident with no formal legal standing, and Troy and Cheryl? The same. If my mother tried to sell the house, I said, what would happen? Gerald folded his hands on the desk. She would list it. She would find a buyer. She would engage a title company. The title company would run a title search, as they always do. They would find the existing deed. They would contact the deed holder to confirm authorization for the sale. He paused. They would contact you. I nodded slowly. She cannot sell without your signature, Gerald said. She cannot refinance. She cannot take out a home equity line. She cannot do anything that requires clear title, because clear title belongs to you. If she attempted any of those things without your knowledge, it would constitute fraud. I drove home from Gerald's office in the early evening, through the tail end of rush hour, the city slow and lit up orange in the low sun. I stopped at the grocery store on my block and bought pasta and a bottle of wine and a bunch of tulips that were already starting to open, pale yellow, the color of early spring. I made dinner. I ate at my kitchen counter and looked out at the city below and thought about Ruth, about what it means to love someone quietly over a long period of time in ways they cannot see, about the particular kind of care that does not announce itself, that makes plans and keeps them, that trusts the person it loves to eventually be ready. I thought about what Gerald had said about my tendency not to look too hard at the machinery. Ruth had planned around it, and now I was going to use it. Over the next several weeks, I built what I thought of privately as a file, not a file of grievances. I had never been a person who kept lists of wrongs, a file of facts, dates, figures, correspondences. I requested a copy of the full trust document, all 63 pages. I requested the deed. I requested the mortgage statement, which showed the outstanding balance, $214,000, with my name in the upper left corner where the borrower's name always goes. I put everything in a folder in my desk drawer, and I went back to work. The bills from Diane kept coming. May $178, spring utilities and lawn maintenance, your share, June, $203, air conditioning startup and pest control. Each envelope was hand-addressed in Diane's Carol cursive, with a small note inside that said simply, "Please remit at your convenience," as though convenience was a thing she had ever extended to me in either direction. I did not pay them. I did not respond to them. I filed them in a second folder behind the first one, and I let summer arrive. It was Troy who called in August. I was on a job site in Pilsen when my phone buzzed, his name on the screen. I let it ring. He left a voicemail. I listened to it, standing beside a half-finished concrete wall with the sound of power tools somewhere above me. Hey. So Mom's been talking about the house. About the future. She and Cheryl and I have been having some conversations and we want to loop you in. There might be some changes coming. Call me back. I looked at the wall in front of me. Someone had chalked measurements on it in blue, numbers, and arrows, the language of a building in progress. I put my phone in my pocket. I did not call him back. But I knew what changes coming meant, and I knew that the road they were walking had just gotten significantly shorter. I want to tell you about my grandmother Ruth, the way she actually was, not the way people describe women like her at funerals. She was not soft. She was not the kind of grandmother who pressed cookies into your hands and called you her sunshine. She was precise and observant and occasionally uncomfortable to be around, the way very honest people sometimes are. She had grown up in Rockford, the daughter of a tool and die machinist, and she had worked as a bookkeeper for 30 years before she retired. And she had the particular quality of mind that comes from spending a career making sure numbers told the truth. She did not trust sentiment. She trusted documentation. She had married into the Bennett family when my father was the kind of man she believed he would remain, steady, independent, clear-eyed. What she had not anticipated, or perhaps had anticipated and simply hoped otherwise, was Diane. I did not understand the full shape of Ruth's concern until I sat down one Thursday evening in late August with the 63-page trust document, a legal pad, and a cup of coffee that went cold before I was halfway through. I had read the document before, twice, in full, but this time I was reading it the way Gerald had trained me to read it, looking for the architecture beneath the language. The places where Ruth had made choices and why. The trust had been established on March 14, 2009. I was 12 years old. The triggering event, Gerald had told me, was something that had happened at Christmas 2008, something he said Ruth had described to him only in general terms, a situation involving money, and the way certain members of the family had spoken about me in a room they believed Ruth had left. He did not know the specifics. I thought about Christmas 2008 for a while. I remembered it as a quiet holiday, unremarkable. Then I remembered a conversation I had overheard from the upstairs hallway, Troy's voice and Diane's voice. Something about college funds and who deserved what. And I remembered going back to my room and sitting on my bed and deciding not to think about it. Ruth had heard the same conversation. She had not gone back to her room. She had called Gerald Okafor in January. The trust document was structured in 3 layers. The first layer established the trust itself and named me as sole beneficiary. The second layer transferred the property on Ellsworth Lane into the trust. This had been completed on November 7, 2013, the same week that Diane had redecorated the living room with furniture she had selected without consulting anyone. The timing felt deliberate, though I had no way to confirm that. The third layer was what Gerald called the protection clause, and it was the part I read 3 times. The protection clause stated that in the event of any attempt to sell, transfer, refinance, or otherwise encumber the property by any party other than the named beneficiary, the trust would automatically vest all rights and remedies in the beneficiary, including the right to immediate legal action, recovery of any costs incurred, and, this was the part that made me set down my pen, the right to require vacant possession within 60 days. 60 days, Diane could be given 60 days to leave her own home. Except it had never been her home. That was the entire point. I looked at that paragraph for a long time. Outside my window, the city was doing what Chicago does in late August, releasing heat slowly into the evening, the streets below still warm from the afternoon, people moving through the West Loop in the particular unhurried way of a summer that knows it is almost over. Ruth had written this clause 13 years ago, and she had never told me. I thought about why. I thought about what she had known about me at 12, at 19, at 26 when she had sent me documents to sign, and trusted that I would sign them without understanding them yet. She had known I was not ready. She had known that if she had told me, I would have done something with the information before I knew how to use it properly. Said something at the wrong dinner table, given something away. Spent years in a low-grade state of awareness that would have changed who I was in ways she did not want it to change me. She had wanted me to grow up first. She had wanted me to become the kind of person who could hold this quietly and decide what to do with it herself. The property on Ellsworth Lane was currently assessed at $1.4 million. The outstanding mortgage balance was $214,000, which meant the net equity was approximately $1.186 million. The mortgage payment was $1,340 per month, drawn automatically from an account Gerald administered on behalf of the trust. An account funded by a separate asset Ruth had left, a portfolio of municipal bonds she had assembled over 30 years of careful, unhurried saving. The mortgage had been paid on time every month for years. Diane had never noticed because Diane had never looked. She had assumed the house was simply paid for, or that the mechanics of how it was paid for were someone else's concern. She had signed where she was asked to sign and had not read what she was signing. I set the legal pad aside. I had filled 4 pages with notes, figures, timelines. I looked at the first page, where I had written at the top, underlined twice, "What can she actually do?" And below it the answer I had arrived at after 63 pages. Nothing. Without my signature, nothing. I called Gerald the next morning. "I want to understand the timeline," I said. "If someone were to attempt to list the property with a real estate agent, walk me through exactly what would happen and at what point I would be notified." Gerald walked me through it. The listing, the showing, the offer, the accepted contract, the title search. The title search was the moment. The title company would pull the deed, find my name, and be legally required to contact me before the transaction could proceed. The whole process from listing to title search typically took between 30 and 60 days, so I would know. I said, "You would know," he confirmed, and at that point, I could stop it. At that point, you would have full legal authority to stop it. Yes. I thanked him and hung up. I went to my desk and opened the second folder, the one with Diane's bills in it. May, June. I had not opened the July envelope yet. I opened it now, 189, lawn service and water bill, your share. Please remit. I put it back in the folder. I thought about the protection clause, the 60 days, the automatic vesting of rights and remedies. I thought about Ruth's handwriting on the birthday cards she used to send. Small and precise, no flourishes. Every letter fully formed. She had not written me a letter. She had not left me a note explaining any of this. She had left me a 63-page legal document and trusted me to read it. That was her way of saying she believed in me. I closed the folder. I made dinner. I went to bed early, and for the first time in a long time I slept without waking up at 3 in the morning, with the particular low hum of anxiety that had lived in my chest for most of my adult life. It was quiet. Remarkably, specifically quiet. Some weights, when you finally understand their shape, stop feeling like weights at all. The Thanksgiving bill arrived on a Monday, not at Thanksgiving. Before it, Diane had mailed it 11 days in advance, which told me she had been planning it for longer than that. You do not mail an itemized bill 11 days early unless you have been thinking about it for a while. Unless you have sat down at some point with a notepad and worked out the math and decided that the math was the point, the envelope was the same as the others. White, standard size, my name in her careful cursive. Inside was a single sheet of paper printed with a header that said holiday meal contribution. Thanksgiving, and below it a column of line items that she had organized with the thoroughness of someone who had given this genuine thought. Turkey, heritage breed, sourced from a farm in Wisconsin, $94. Stuffing, cranberry sauce, green bean casserole, sweet potatoes with the brown sugar crust I had loved since I was 7 years old, 112. Pie, 2 kinds, pecan and pumpkin, 47. Beverages, cider and wine, $38. Paper goods and decorative items, $21. Utilities for the day, prorated, $38. And at the bottom, the line that had been there since Easter, unchanged in its plainness. Hosting fee. Total due from Paige Bennett, $494. I read it twice. I set it on my kitchen counter and made coffee and stood there looking at it while the coffee brewed. The morning light was coming in flat and gray off the lake, the kind of November light that does not warm anything, just illuminates. I thought about the sweet potatoes with the brown sugar crust. I had loved them since I was 7. My mother knew that. She had written it on the bill anyway, not despite knowing, I realized, but because of it. The bill was not about money. Diane made more in a month from my father's pension and her own part-time bookkeeping work than the total of every bill she had sent me combined. The bill was about something else. The bill was about making sure I understood my position. Making sure I felt, every time I sat at that table, that I was a guest who owed something for the privilege. I put the bill in the second folder with the others. That evening Troy called again. This time I answered, "Did you get Mom's thing?" He said. He did not say bill. He said thing, the way people say words they have decided to soften. I did, I said. "It's really not a big deal, Paige. She just wants everyone to contribute." "Okay," I said. There was a pause. Troy was not good at pauses. He filled them. "Look, there's also something else. We've been talking, me and Cheryl and Mom, about the house. What about it? It's a significant asset. Mom and Dad aren't going to live there forever. We think it makes sense to start thinking about the future. What the plan is." "You know." I waited. "There's been some interest," he said, "from a developer. A guy Doug knows through the club. He builds high-end stuff on the North Shore. He came by and looked at the property, and he thinks the lot alone is worth a conversation." I looked out my window at the city. A woman was walking a dog below, moving quickly against the wind. "That's interesting," I said. "We're just in early conversations," Troy said, "nothing formal, but we want to make sure everyone's on the same page. As a family." "Of course," I said. "So you're good?" "I'm good, Troy." He sounded relieved, which told me he had expected resistance and had prepared arguments he now would not need to use. We said goodbye and hung up. I sat with my phone in my hand for a moment. A developer. Doug's contact from the club. Early conversations. I called Gerald the next morning and told him what Troy had said. Gerald listened without interrupting, which was his way. "They're moving faster than I expected," I said. "People often do," he said. When they believe an asset is theirs and they've decided to act on it, what do I need to do? Nothing yet, Gerald said. Wait. Let them engage the developer. Let them engage an agent if that's the direction. The moment they attempt a formal transaction, the title search will surface the deed. That is the moment, and until then? Until then, he said, you go to Thanksgiving. I did not want to go to Thanksgiving. I want to be clear about that. There was no part of me that wanted to sit at that table in that house and eat the meal I had been billed for in advance, smile at Troy and Cheryl, watch Diane preside over the table like a woman who owned everything in her sight. But Gerald was right. Absence would signal awareness. Awareness would make them careful. And careful people are harder to catch. So I went. I drove up on Thanksgiving morning, the highway thin and fast with holiday traffic moving in both directions, the sky the particular colorless white of late November in the Midwest. I stopped at a gas station in Northbrook and sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes with the engine running, listening to the heat move through the vents. I thought about something Ruth had said to me once at a different Thanksgiving years ago. We had been standing in the kitchen after dinner, just the two of us, washing dishes the old way because Ruth did not trust dishwashers with good china. She had handed me a plate to dry and said, without preamble, the thing about this family, Paige, is that they confuse loudness with power. Don't make that mistake. I had not understood what she meant then. I was maybe 22, 23. I had nodded and dried the plate and set it in the cabinet. I understood now. I pulled back onto the highway and drove the rest of the way to Lake Forest. Dinner was at 2. The table was set with Ruth's china, the set with the gold rim, which Diane had moved into her own cabinet the week after the funeral, and which now lived permanently in the built-in hutch in the dining room, as though it had always been there. The food was good. It always was. Whatever else my mother was, she cooked with genuine care, and the sweet potatoes with the brown sugar crust were exactly as I remembered them. Troy was expansive in the way he got when he believed something was going his way. He talked about the developer, not directly, but in the coded way of someone who wants credit for a plan without fully revealing it. He mentioned the property market on the North Shore, twice. He mentioned Doug's contact from the club once, casually, like a man dropping a card on the table to see if anyone picked it up. Cheryl talked about what she would do with her share. She did not say share, she said, when things get sorted out, and then described a trip to Portugal she and Doug had been planning, and a kitchen renovation she had put on hold, and an investment account she wanted to open for their younger son. I listened and ate. At the end of the meal, Diane collected the dessert plates and then came back and stood at the head of the table and looked at me with the particular expression she reserved for moments when she believed she had leverage. I haven't received your contribution for the past several months, she said. Or for today, she said it in front of everyone. She had always preferred an audience. I looked at her across the length of Ruth's table, on top of Ruth's china, in Ruth's house. I know, I said. She waited for more. I did not give her more. Troy cleared his throat. Cheryl refilled her wine glass. Doug looked at the tablecloth. Well, Diane said finally, we'll need to sort that out. We will, I said, and I smiled at her and meant it, and she did not know why. December arrived the way it always does in Chicago. Not gradually, but all at once, like a door swung open onto a different world. The temperature dropped 14 degrees in a single afternoon the first week of the month, and the wind off the lake turned hard and directional, the kind that finds the gap between your coat collar and your scarf and stays there. I had a project in the final stages of construction in Pilsen, a mixed-use building, 4 stories, ground floor retail and 12 residential units above. And I was on site most mornings that month, walking the floors in a hard hat with a set of drawings tucked under my arm, checking the work against the plans the way I always did. Looking for the places where intention and execution had come apart, I found the divergences. I always did. That was the job. I was on the 4th floor on a Thursday morning, looking at a window installation that was 2 inches off the specified height, when my phone buzzed with a number I did not recognize. I let it go to voicemail. 10 minutes later, walking back to my car, I listened. It was a woman named Karen Bryce. She was a real estate agent with a firm in Winnetka. She said she was reaching out regarding a property on Ellsworth Lane in Lake Forest that she had recently been engaged to represent, and that she would appreciate a call back at my earliest convenience regarding a question about the listing. I sat in my car with the heat running and listened to the message twice. Karen Bryce had called me. Not Diane. Me. which meant Karen Bryce had done what competent real estate agents do before they take a listing. She had run a preliminary title check, or had her office do one, and the preliminary check had surfaced my name, and now Karen Bryce had a question that she was being professionally careful about how she asked. I called Gerald. A real estate agent contacted me, I said. Winnetka firm. She's been engaged to represent the Ellsworth Lane property. Gerald was quiet for 3 seconds, which for Gerald was a long time. She called you directly? Yes. Then she's done due diligence. She knows something is not straightforward with the title. What do I do? Call her back, Gerald said. Be pleasant. Answer her questions honestly. Tell her you are the title holder and that you have not authorized a sale. Let her draw her own conclusions about how she wishes to proceed with her clients. I called Karen Bryce from the parking lot of a coffee shop on Western Avenue. She answered on the first ring, which told me she had been waiting. She was professional and careful in her language, the kind of careful that signals someone who has been in an uncomfortable situation before and has learned how to navigate it without creating liability. She confirmed she had been engaged by a Mrs. Diane Bennett to list the property. She confirmed she had run a preliminary title check. She said she had found a discrepancy she wanted to clarify before proceeding. I'm the title holder, I said. My name is Paige Bennett. The property is held in a trust of which I am the sole beneficiary. I have not authorized a sale. There was a silence on Karen Bryce's end that was neither surprised nor unsurprised. It was the silence of a professional who has just confirmed what she already suspected and is now calculating her next step. I see, she said. Thank you for clarifying that, Ms. Bennett. Of course, I said. I'll need to speak with my clients, I understand, I said. Thank you for reaching out directly. We hung up. I sat in the parking lot and drank my coffee and watched two pigeons argue over a piece of bread on the side. I did not call Diane. I did not call Troy. I did not send a letter or an email or any communication of any kind. Gerald had advised me from the beginning. Do not tip your hand before the moment. Let the process work. The process was working, what I did not know. What I found out later, from Karen Bryce herself, in a conversation we had after everything was over, was what happened on Diane's end in the days following that call. Karen Bryce had called Diane and told her there was a complication with the title. She had not said my name. She had said there appeared to be a discrepancy in the ownership records that would need to be resolved before the listing could proceed. Diane had said that was impossible. Diane had said she had lived in that house for 30 years, and she knew perfectly well whose house it was. Karen Bryce had said she understood, but that the county records were quite clear and that she would need written authorization from the title holder before she could move forward. Diane had called her own lawyer. His name was Martin Hale, and he was a general practice attorney in Highland Park who handled wills and contracts and the occasional real estate matter. He was, by Karen Bryce's later assessment, a competent man who had not encountered a situation quite like this one. He had pulled the county records himself. He had found the deed. He had found the trust. He had found Gerald Okafor's name on the trust documents and had called Gerald's office. Gerald had taken the call and had been, by his own description, polite and precise. Martin Hale had called Diane back. I do not know exactly what he said, but I know what happened next, because Troy called me 4 days later and his voice had lost the expansiveness it had carried at Thanksgiving. It was flat now. Careful, we need to talk. He said, okay, I said. About the house, okay, there seems to be some kind of issue with the paperwork. I noticed he said seems to be, and some kind of… The language of a man who has received information he does not fully accept and is not yet ready to name directly. I had spent 32 years watching my family use language as a way of controlling what was real. I recognized the technique. What kind of issue? I said. I don't. Look, Mom's lawyer is looking into it. There's apparently something with the deed. Some kind of trust thing, he paused. Did you know about this? I looked out my apartment window. Below, a delivery truck was idling at the corner, exhaust rising pale against the cold air. I think we should probably let the lawyers handle it, I said. Troy was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed again, lower, with an edge in it I recognized too. It was the voice he used when he believed he was not being given something he was owed. Paige. If you have information about this property that affects our family, you have an obligation to tell us. I thought about the word obligation. I thought about the bills in the folder in my desk drawer. May, June, July, the Thanksgiving pre-bill with its $144 hosting fee and its line for sweet potatoes with brown sugar crust. I thought about Easter and the table, and Diane's folded hands, and perhaps the holiday gatherings aren't the right fit for you. I thought about obligation. I'll be at Christmas, I said. We can talk then. Troy started to say something else. I said goodbye and hung up. I went to my desk and opened the folder with the trust documents and took out page 47 and read the protection clause again. The 60 days, the automatic vesting of rights and remedies, the right to require vacant possession. Then I opened my laptop and sent Gerald a short email. They've engaged a lawyer, Martin Hale, Highland Park. I believe they'll make a move before Christmas. I'll be there, Gerald replied within the hour. Understood. I'll be available. Do not engage without calling me first. I closed the laptop. I made dinner, pasta, simple, the kind I made when I did not want to think about cooking. I ate at the counter and looked at the city and thought about Christmas. I thought about what it would feel like to sit at that table one more time, in that house, knowing what I knew, while they maneuvered around me with their careful language and their lawyers and their developer from the club. I thought about Ruth washing dishes after Thanksgiving dinner, handing me a plate, saying they confuse loudness with power. I was not loud. I had never been loud, but Christmas was 3 weeks away, and I was ready. Christmas in Lake Forest has a particular quality that I have always found difficult to explain to people who did not grow up there. It is not the warmth of Christmas the way people mean when they say they love Christmas. It is something more formal than that. The houses on Ellsworth Lane go up their lights the weekend after Thanksgiving. White lights, always white, because colored lights are considered in poor taste in certain zip codes, and the wreaths go on the doors. And for about 3 weeks in December, the street has the appearance of a place where everything is exactly as it should be. It is a beautiful illusion. I had grown up inside it and learned early that the inside of a beautiful illusion is just a house with problems, same as anywhere else. I drove up on December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas, which was earlier than my usual arrival, but I had a reason for coming early that I had not shared with anyone. I had called Karen Bryce the week before, not to discuss the property. That conversation was over, at least between the two of us. I called because Karen Bryce had struck me, in our brief exchange, as a woman who paid attention, and I wanted to know what she had observed when she had visited the house. She was guarded at first, understandably. She had a professional situation that was still unresolved. But when I explained that I was the title holder and that I was trying to understand the full picture before the holidays, she relaxed slightly and told me what she had seen. The developer Doug knew from the club had visited the property twice. His name was Stephen Pratt, and he built custom homes on the North Shore. The kind that started at $3 million and went up from there. He had walked the lot, measured the setbacks, and had expressed strong interest in the land. He and Diane had apparently had 2 conversations about price. Diane had told him she expected to have the title situation resolved within the month and that they could proceed to contract in January. She had told the developer she would have the title situation resolved. She had done this without speaking to me, without speaking to Gerald, without any legal basis for the confidence she was projecting. She had simply decided that whatever the complication was, it would be handled, because complications in Diane Bennett's life were always handled, because she was the kind of woman who had always moved through the world as though her intentions were sufficient to alter facts. I thanked Karen Bryce and hung up. I called Gerald and told him about Stephen Pratt and the January timeline Diane had given him. She's going to push hard over Christmas, Gerald said. She'll want to pressure you in person. Emotional leverage, family obligation, the usual instruments. He paused. Are you prepared for that? Yes, I said. If she presents anything in writing, any document she wants you to sign, do not sign it. Call me first, I won't sign anything. And Paige, his voice shifted slightly, the way it did when he was moving from the legal to the human. Whatever happens, remember that you are not obligated to perform for them. You don't need to be cruel, but you don't need to be accommodating either. You can simply be present. I thought about that on the drive up. Simply be present. It sounded easier than it was, in that house, with those people. But I had been practicing something like it for months now. The art of being in a room without giving anything away. And I was better at it than I had been at Easter. I arrived at 2 in the afternoon on the 23rd. The white lights were up, the wreath was on the door, and there were 2 cars in the driveway I did not recognize. I sat in my car and looked at them for a moment before going in. One belonged to Martin Hale, Diane's lawyer. I recognized him when I walked in. compact mid-50s, a navy blazer that said he had made an effort. He was sitting in the living room with Diane and Troy. Cheryl was in the kitchen with Doug, who looked at me when I came in with an expression that landed somewhere between sympathy and relief that he was not me. Diane stood when I came in and hugged me with the specific firmness of a woman who is performing warmth for an audience. She said, I looked well. She offered me coffee. She showed no indication that anything unusual was occurring, which told me she had decided on a strategy, and the strategy was to present this as a routine family conversation. Martin Hale stood and shook my hand. He introduced himself with the careful neutrality of a man who was aware he was in a delicate position. He said he was there as a family friend, which was the kind of thing lawyers say when they want you to believe they are not there as a lawyer. Troy did not hug me. He nodded from the couch. We sat down. Diane poured coffee. There was a plate of Christmas cookies on the table, the kind she made every year from a recipe that had been Ruth's. Pressed butter cookies with colored sugar, stars and trees and bells. I took one. It was very good. It was always very good. We want to talk about the future, Diane began. She had clearly prepared an opening, and this was it, as a family, about what makes sense for everyone going forward. Martin Hale had a folder on his knee. He opened it with the unhurried motion of a man who had done this before and was not uncomfortable doing it again. There's a document we'd like you to look at, Diane said. It's just a clarification. Something that would allow us to move forward with some plans we've been making. She nodded to Martin Hale, who produced 2 pages from his folder and leaned across the coffee table to hand them to me. I took them. I read them. It was a quitclaim deed. My name was on it as grantor. The grantee was Diane Margaret Bennett. The property was described in full: lot dimensions, legal description, tax parcel number. At the bottom was a signature line with my name typed below it. If I signed this document, I would transfer my ownership of the property to my mother. For nothing, no consideration. A gift on paper worth $1.4 million. I read it twice. I set it on the coffee table. I'd like some time to review this with my own attorney, I said. Diane's expression did not change, but I saw the small tightening around her eyes that meant she had anticipated this and had a response ready. It's really just a formality, Paige. It clarifies what's always been the case, that this is the family home. We're not trying to take anything from you, I understand, I said. I'd still like to review it with my attorney. Troy shifted on the couch. It's Christmas, Paige. We're not asking you to go to court. We're asking you to sign one piece of paper so we can move forward as a family. I looked at him. I thought about Gerald's saying, you don't need to be accommodating. I thought about the bills in the folder in my desk. I thought about Easter and Diane's folded hands, and perhaps the holiday gatherings aren't the right fit for you. I'm not going to sign this today, I said. My voice was level. I'll speak with my attorney after the holidays and we'll go from there. Martin Hale closed his folder. He had the expression of a man who had advised his client that this might happen and was not surprised that it had. Diane looked at me for a long moment. Something shifted in her face, not the anger I expected, but something colder than anger, a recalibration. All right, she said. We'll talk after the holidays. The rest of December 23rd passed in the particular tense quiet of a house where something important has just been decided and no one is willing to acknowledge it yet. Dinner was pasta and salad, nothing formal. Troy and Cheryl watched television. Doug helped me wash the dishes, and in the kitchen, standing at the sink with the water running, he said quietly without looking at me, "For what it's worth, I'm sorry about all of this." I handed him a dish to dry. "Thank you, Doug. I hope it works out the way it should." I looked at him. He was looking at the dish in his hands. He was a careful man who had spent years watching this family from the adjacent seat and had drawn his own conclusions and kept them to himself. "It will," I said. I drove back to Chicago that night. I did not stay over. I called Gerald from the car, hands-free on the highway, and told him about the quitclaim deed. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "They're out of moves, Paige. That document was their last real option. Short of legal action, which they cannot win, there is nothing left for them to do." "They'll try again," I said. "Probably," he said, "but trying is not the same as succeeding." I drove south on I-94 through the cold dark, the city lights growing ahead of me on the horizon, orange and white against the low clouds. I thought about Stephen Pratt, the developer, who had been told to expect a contract in January. I thought about Diane in the living room with her Christmas cookies and her folder of documents, so certain that her intention was sufficient to alter facts. I thought about Thanksgiving. The bill for $494 with the $144 hosting fee, and the line for sweet potatoes with brown sugar crust. And I thought about what I was going to do about it, because I had made a decision, sometime between Easter and now, about how this was going to end. Not with a lawyer's letter. Not with a quiet transfer of documents. I was going to let it end the way my family had started it. At a table, in front of witnesses, with everything visible. I just needed one more gathering. I picked up my phone and sent Diane a text. I'll be at Thanksgiving next year. I'm looking forward to it, she replied in 11 minutes. Wonderful. We'll plan something special. I put my phone down and drove the rest of the way home in the dark. And I was already thinking about the following November, and about what would be different when it came. The following November arrived the way I had been waiting for it to arrive. Quietly, without ceremony. The way things you have prepared for a long time tend to feel when they finally come. I had spent the intervening 11 months doing three things. The first was work. The Pilsen project finished in February and was written up in a small architecture journal in April, which led to two new inquiries and one serious conversation with the developer in the South Loop about a residential project that would be the largest commission of my career. I said yes in May and signed the contract in June. By October, I had a team of 4 and a studio space in Bridgeport with north-facing windows, and a drafting table I had built myself from reclaimed oak. The second thing was patience. Diane had sent 2 more letters after Christmas, one in February, one in April, both routed through Martin Hale. Both asking in careful legal language whether I had reconsidered my position regarding the property. Gerald had responded to both with equally careful language that said, in essence, no. After April, the letters stopped. The bills stopped too. I did not know whether this was capitulation or strategy, and I did not spend much time thinking about it. I was focused on the third thing. The third thing was preparation. In March, I had called Karen Bryce. I told her I wanted to understand what a legitimate sale of the Ellsworth Lane property would look like. Timeline, process, what a buyer would need for me as title holder. She was professional and thorough, and at the end of the conversation said, without prompting, Ms. Bennett, for what it's worth, I hope this gets sorted out in a way that makes sense for you. I thanked her and meant it. In June, I called Stephen Pratt directly. I had found his number through a mutual contact in the architecture community. The North Shore development world was not large, and my firm's name had enough presence that the call was returned within a day. I told him I was the title holder of the Ellsworth Lane property, and that I was aware he had been in conversations with the current residents about a potential sale. He was careful at first then. When I explained the situation plainly, he was candid. He was still interested. The lot was exceptional. If I ever decided to sell, he would welcome a conversation. I told him I would be in touch. In September, I called Gerald and told him I wanted to be ready to move before the end of the year. Gerald had the trust documents updated, the deed confirmed, and prepared a letter that could be delivered at the moment of my choosing. A formal notice to the current residents of their status as tenants at will and the commencement of the 60-day clock the protection clause had always allowed me to start. The letter was sitting in Gerald's office on the morning of Thanksgiving. I drove up to Lake Forest on a gray November morning, the highway quiet in the early hours, the landscape stripped and flat in the way it gets after the leaves come down and before the snow arrives. A between-season bleakness that I had always found honest, somehow. More truthful than the green of summer or the white of winter. Just the bare structure of things, visible. I had known something was different when Diane called 3 weeks earlier. She had called herself, not through Martin Hale. Which was the first signal. Her voice had been warm, in the particular way it got when she wanted something, and had decided warmth was the instrument. She said she was planning a special Thanksgiving this year. A larger gathering, some family friends, a few of Doug's business associates. She said Stephen Pratt and his wife might stop by for dessert. She said it casually, as though this detail were incidental. It was not incidental. She was staging a closing. She was going to use Thanksgiving dinner as the setting for what she believed would be the final act. Stephen Pratt at the table, the family assembled, the social pressure of witnesses arrayed against me like furniture arranged to block an exit. She was going to present the quitclaim deed again, or something like it, in front of people, because she had calculated that I would not refuse in public what I had refused in private. She did not know that I had been waiting for exactly this. I arrived at noon. The driveway had 4 cars I did not recognize. Inside, the house smelled like it always smelled at Thanksgiving: roasting turkey, sage, the faint sweetness of pie cooling somewhere. Ruth's china was on the table, set for 14. Diane was in the kitchen in her linen apron, moving with the brisk efficiency of a woman orchestrating something larger than dinner. She hugged me at the door. Firm, perfunctory, the performance of warmth. She said, I looked wonderful. She introduced me to the people I did not know. A couple named the Hendersons from the club, a woman named Carol, who was Cheryl's friend from the PTA, two of Doug's business associates whose names I did not retain, and Stephen Pratt, who was standing near the fireplace with a glass of wine, a broad man in his early 50s with the particular confidence of someone who builds things, and has been told repeatedly that this is impressive. He shook my hand. His grip was firm and his eyes were assessing in the way that developers' eyes tend to be. Measuring, calculating square footage. Paige, he said, I've heard a lot about you. I'm sure you have, I said. Diane steered me toward the living room. Troy was on the couch with a drink, looking at his phone. Cheryl was arranging a centerpiece with the focused attention of a woman trying very hard to appear relaxed. Doug was in the corner, talking to one of the business associates, and caught my eye when I walked in and gave me the smallest nod. The nod of a man who knew what was coming and had decided to be somewhere else when it happened. Dinner was at 2. We sat down, 14 people around Ruth's table, on Ruth's chairs, using Ruth's china with the gold rim. The food was extraordinary, because Diane cooked with genuine care and always had. The turkey was perfect. The sweet potatoes with the brown sugar crust were exactly as I remembered them. I ate and listened and contributed when spoken to and watched the room the way I had learned to watch rooms. Stephen Pratt sat 3 seats to my left. He and Diane exchanged glances twice during the meal. Small, coordinated glances that confirmed what I already knew about the choreography of the afternoon. After the pie, pecan and pumpkin, both excellent, Diane stood at the head of the table. She thanked everyone for coming. She talked about family and tradition and the importance of honoring what had been built over generations. She talked about the house, its history, its meaning. She talked about the future. She talked about the difficult but necessary conversations that families sometimes had to have about assets and legacies and what it meant to steward something well. And then she looked at me. We've had some conversations over the past year, she said, to the table, to the room, to the witnesses she had assembled, about the future of this property. I believe we're at a point where we can resolve things simply and cleanly as a family. She reached to the sideboard behind her and picked up a folder. Paige, I'd like to revisit the document we discussed at Christmas. I think with everyone here, we can finally get this settled. The table was very quiet. Stephen Pratt was watching me. The Hendersons were watching me. Carol from the PTA was watching me. Troy was watching me with the carefully neutral expression of a man who had rehearsed neutrality. Cheryl had her hands in her lap. I looked at my mother. I reached into my bag and took out my phone. Before we do that, I said, I need to take a call. I've been expecting it. I looked around the table. At the faces of people who had been brought here to watch me bend, assembled like an audience for a conclusion that had already been written. I apologize. It will just take a moment. I dialed Gerald's office. He answered on the first ring as we had arranged. I put the phone on the table, face up, speaker on. Gerald, I said, I'm at the property on Ellsworth Lane. I'm going to need you to confirm a few things for the people here. Gerald's voice came through the phone, clear and unhurried, filling the room the way a voice does when a room has gone completely silent. Of course, he said. What would you like me to confirm? I looked at my mother across the length of Ruth's table, the owner of the property at this address. I said, Can you confirm who that is? There was a pause of exactly 2 seconds, not hesitation. Precision. The property at that address, Gerald said, is held in the Ruth Eleanor Bennett Living Trust. The sole beneficiary of that trust is Paige Ann Bennett. She is the sole legal owner of the property. No other party holds any ownership interest, title, or right to sell, transfer, or encumber the property in any way. Stephen Pratt set down his wineglass. The Hendersons looked at each other. Diane had not moved. She was standing at the head of the table with the folder in her hand, and her face had gone the particular color of someone who has just understood that the ground they were standing on was not what they believed it to be. Thank you, Gerald, I said. Of course, he said. The formal notice has been prepared. Whenever you're ready, I'll call you after dinner, I said. I ended the call. The room was silent in the way that rooms are silent when something irreversible has just occurred, and no one has yet decided how to respond. I looked at Stephen Pratt. I apologize for any confusion about the status of this property, I said. I'm happy to discuss a legitimate sale at your convenience. You have my number. He nodded once, slowly, the nod of a man recalibrating. I looked at my mother. She was still holding the folder. The silence lasted longer than silences usually do. It was the kind of silence that has weight to it, not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that has just changed and cannot be unchanged. 14 people around a table and not one of them speaking. The only sound, the faint tick of the clock on the mantel that had been in that house, since before I was born, the same clock Ruth used to wind on Sunday mornings with a small brass key she kept in the kitchen drawer. Diane was still standing. She was still holding the folder. Her face had moved. Through several expressions in the space of those seconds, the initial blankness of someone whose script has just been taken from them. Then something that looked briefly like confusion, as though the information she had received could not yet be processed as real, and then something harder. Not anger yet. The thing that comes before anger, when the mind is still trying to find an alternate explanation and failing. Troy broke the silence. What does that mean? He said. His voice was flat, stripped of the expansiveness it had carried for months. He was looking at me. It means what it sounds like, I said. The house is yours. He said it not as a question but as a repetition. The way people repeat things when their mind needs a second pass. Yes. Cheryl made a sound. Not a word, just a sound. A small exhalation that could have been the beginning of several different things. Her hands were still in her lap, and her face had gone pale in the way that faces go pale. When blood moves away from the surface, when the body decides there is something more important happening than maintaining appearances. Stephen Pratt put his napkin on the table and pushed back his chair a few inches. Not standing, not leaving, but creating distance. The gesture of a man who understood he was in a room where something private was occurring and was preparing to no longer be in it. Diane, Martin Hale said. He was at the far end of the table, and I had not noticed him until this moment. He had been invited to this gathering too, positioned near the exit, the legal backstop for the plan that was now not a plan. He said her name with the careful inflection of an attorney, trying to prevent a client from saying something inadvisable. Diane looked at him. Then she looked back at me. This is my home, she said. Her voice was controlled, but only barely. I could hear the effort in it, the compression of something much larger being held at the diameter of her composure. I have lived here for 30 years. I know, I said. Your grandmother would never have. She stopped. Started again. Ruth would never have done this. Ruth did do this, I said, 13 years ago. Deliberately. With full knowledge of what she was doing and why. Diane's face changed again. Something in it cracked. Not visibly, not dramatically, but I saw it. The way you see a fault line in a wall before the wall comes apart. She had spent 13 years living in a house she did not own, presiding over a table that belonged to someone she had treated as peripheral, billing that person for dinners eaten on china that had been left in trust for that same person, and she had not known, because she had signed where she was asked to sign and had not read what she was signing. Ruth had counted on that. Ruth had planned around it. You knew, Diane said. It was not a question. Her eyes were fixed on me with an intensity I had not seen from her before, stripped of the management, the performance, the careful calibration of how she presented herself to rooms, just the raw fact of her, looking at me. You knew and you let us. She gestured at the table, at the folder in her hand, at the whole elaborate arrangement of this afternoon. You let us do all of this. I wanted to understand what you would do, I said. When you believed something was yours that wasn't, the Hendersons were looking at their plates. Carol from the PTA was looking at the centerpiece. Doug's business associates had the careful stillness of men who attended a dinner party and arrived at a family dissolution and were being extremely professional about it. Doug himself was looking at the tablecloth. But I noticed, in the periphery, that his shoulders had a quality about them. A very slight relaxation, the barely perceptible loosening of a man who has been waiting for something to be over for a long time. Troy stood up. He stood the way men stand when they have decided they are going to say something definitive and want the room to register that they are standing. He was taller than me, and he had always used that in a physical way, the way some people use height, as an argument, a presence, a way of making the air around themselves seem more significant. You have no right to do this, he said. He was not talking about the property now. He was talking about the afternoon, about being watched walking toward the end of a road he had not known was being watched. This is a family matter. You could have come to us. You could have talked to us. You didn't have to turn it into, he gestured at the room. I tried to talk. I said at Easter, at Thanksgiving last year, at Christmas. I looked at him steadily. You handed me a bill for $494 and a quitclaim deed and a room full of witnesses. Troy sat back down. Not the way he had stood deliberately, with intention, but the way people sit when the blood has gone out of an argument and the body has nothing left to hold itself up with. Cheryl was crying. Quietly, with her hands still in her lap, tears moving down her face without her doing anything about them. It was the most unguarded I had ever seen her, and I felt something about it that I did not expect to feel. Not satisfaction, not vindication, but a kind of sadness. For the family we had not been. For the things that had calcified over years into this shape. Diane sat down. She sat slowly, the way people sit when they have been standing for a long time and have suddenly remembered that they are tired. The folder was still in her hand. She set it on the table in front of her. She looked at it for a moment, and then she looked at me with an expression I had never seen from her before. Not in 32 years. It was not anger. It was not the controlled management of how things appeared. It was something older and more stripped, something that might have been, in a different kind of person, in a different kind of moment, the beginning of understanding. What are you going to do? She said. Her voice was quiet. The audience had dissolved into its constituent parts. The Hendersons were gathering their coats. Stephen Pratt was on his phone in the hallway. Carol from the PTA had somehow disappeared. Martin Hale was still at the table, watching. Gerald has prepared a formal notice, I said. It begins a 60-day period. After 60 days, the property needs to be vacated. Diane looked at me. Troy made a sound, a short, hard sound that was not quite a word. 60 days, Diane said. Yes. It's December, I know. She looked at the folder on the table. She looked at the china, Ruth's china with the gold rim. She looked at the clock on the mantel. Paige. Mom, I said it quietly. I had not called her that in months, and the word landed differently than I expected it to in the room. I'm not doing this to hurt you. I'm doing this because I have to. Because the alternative is to keep pretending that the way things have been is acceptable, and I'm not able to do that anymore. She looked at me for a long time, then Cheryl, who had been crying quietly in her chair, made a sound that was not quiet. A short, sudden sound, a gasp that became a sob, and then she was not sitting upright anymore. She had folded forward onto the table, her forehead on her arms, her shoulders shaking. Doug was at her side immediately, his hand on her back, saying her name. Martin Hale pushed back his chair. Troy was staring at the table, and Diane was looking at me with that expression, stripped and old and tired, and behind her eyes I could see the architecture of what she had built over 30 years coming apart. Not violently, not all at once, but in the quiet incremental way that structures fail when the thing that has been holding them up is finally, and completely, removed. I reached into my bag. I took out a card, Gerald's card, his direct line, his email, and I set it on the table in front of her. Have Martin Hale call him, I said. Gerald will handle everything fairly. I've asked him to. I pushed back my chair, I stood up, and I took my coat from the hook by the door, and I walked out of the house on Ellsworth Lane for what I understood. In the way you understand things you have been moving toward for a very long time. Would be the last time I walked out of it as anything other than its owner. The white lights were on outside. The oak tree in the front yard was bare and dark against the gray November sky. I got in my car. I sat for a moment. I did not feel what I had expected to feel, which was relief. I felt something quieter than that, something that did not have a clean name, a mixture of sorrow and resolution, and the particular exhaustion of a thing that has been carried for a long time and is only now being set down. I started the car. I pulled out of the driveway. I did not look back. The 60 days ended on a Tuesday in February, the kind of day Chicago makes in midwinter that feels like an argument against living there. The temperature 6 degrees above zero, the wind moving off the lake with the focused hostility of something personal. Diane and my father moved out on a Saturday, 3 days before the deadline. I know this because Gerald informed me, and because my father called me the evening before they left. He was the one member of my family who had said very little throughout all of it. Not because he did not know what was happening, but because he was the kind of man who had learned, over 40 years of marriage to Diane, that silence was the most available form of survival. He was 71 and had a quality about him in that phone call that I recognized as grief, though not the grief of losing a house. Something older than that. I want you to know, he said, that I think your grandmother was right. I did not say anything for a moment. She saw things clearly, he said. She always did. I know, I said. I'm sorry. Paige. For my part in it, we talked for 20 minutes. It was the longest conversation we had ever had, just the two of them, just us. He told me about a fishing trip he and Ruth had taken when my father was 12, somewhere in Wisconsin, and how she had sat in the boat for 4 hours without catching anything, and had not complained once, just watched the water. He did not explain why he was telling me this. He did not need to. They moved to a rental in Kenosha, Wisconsin, a two-bedroom apartment on the fourth floor of a building near the lake, about 40 minutes north of the Illinois border. My father said the view of the water was good. He said it quietly, the way people mention small consolations when the larger picture is not what they would have chosen. Troy did not call me. Cheryl called once, in January, a short call in which she said she wanted me to know she didn't blame me, and then said several things that made clear she did blame me, and then said goodbye. I wished her well and meant it, in the way you mean things for people you have given up, hoping will understand you. Doug texted me in March. It said, "The South Loop project looks great. I saw it in the Tribune. Congratulations." I thanked him. He replied with a thumbs up. That was the entirety of it, and it was more than I had expected, and I appreciated it. Gerald delivered the formal notice in December, and the process that followed was orderly and quiet, the way legal processes are when the facts are clear and no one has a viable counter-argument. Martin Hale made 2 inquiries in January that Gerald answered in writing. After that, nothing. I listed the property with Karen Brees in March. She was, as I had suspected, very good at her job. She had the house photographed on a day when the light came through the east windows, the way it did in the morning. The particular light I had grown up with, the light that came into the kitchen while Ruth made coffee and I sat at the table with a bowl of cereal and the sense that the world was manageable. Karen Bryce saw it too. She put it in the listing copy, something about the quality of light, and I read it and thought that was exactly right. We had 3 offers in the first week. All above asking. I accepted the second one, from a family named Okonkwo, a couple in their late 30s with 2 daughters, 8 and 11, who had driven up from Evanston on a Sunday afternoon and walked through every room with the particular quiet attention of people who are trying to imagine their lives inside a space. Mrs. Okonkwo had stood in the kitchen for a long time, looking at the east windows. The light, she said, to no one in particular. Yes, I said. I was there for the showing. Karen Bryce had looked at me when I asked to attend and had simply nodded, understanding, I think, that this was something I needed to do in person. The sale closed on a Friday in May. Gerald called me when the wire transfer confirmed. I was at my studio in Bridgeport, at my drafting table, working on the South Loop residential project. I set down my pencil and looked out the north-facing windows at the sky, which was the particular blue of a Chicago May. The blue that arrives after the gray of winter and the mud of early spring, clean and specific and almost startling after all the months without it. Net proceeds after the mortgage payoff, $1.171 million. I transferred $50,000 to my father's account the following week. He called to refuse it. I told him it was from Ruth, not from me, and that she would have wanted him to have it, which I believed was true. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said thank you, and we talked for another 20 minutes, and I told him about the South Loop project, and he asked questions with what seemed like genuine interest. And somewhere in the middle of the conversation, I realized that we were, for perhaps the first time in my life, simply talking. I used a portion of the proceeds to establish my studio formally, registered it as Bennett Architecture Group, hired 2 additional architects and an office manager, signed a 3-year lease on the Bridgeport space. The South Loop project broke ground in September. The Tribune ran a piece about it in October. The one Doug had seen, with a photograph of me at the site in a hard hat, squinting against the light, a year after the Thanksgiving that ended everything. I was sitting at my kitchen counter in the West Loop on a Sunday morning with coffee and the newspaper, and the particular quiet of a morning that belongs entirely to you, when my phone buzzed with a text from a number I did not have saved. It took me a moment to recognize it as Cheryl's new number. The message said, "I know things ended badly. I hope you're well." I looked at it for a while. I typed back, "I am. I hope you are too." She did not reply. Maybe she would eventually, maybe she wouldn't. I put my phone down and picked up my coffee and looked out the window at the city below, the streets just beginning to move. On a Sunday morning, a woman walking a dog, a man with a bag of groceries, the ordinary incremental motion of people living their lives. I thought about Ruth. I thought about the dinner with white tablecloths, the bottle of wine, the way she had looked at me across the table and said, "You're going to be just fine, Paige." I had been 22. I had not fully believed her. The way you do not fully believe the things that are most important until you have lived your way to the proof of them. I believed her now. The oak tree she had planted the year my father was born was still in the front yard on Ellsworth Lane. I had asked Karen Bryce to include a note in the sale, not in the contract, just a letter to the Okonkwo's from me. It said that the oak tree had been planted by the woman who had owned the house before it came to me, and that she had been a person who planted things for the future without needing to see them grow. I asked them to take care of it if they could. Mrs. Osenso sent me a text 3 weeks after closing. It said, "We will, the girls have already named it." I did not ask what they had named it. Some things are better left to the people who come after you, to name in their own way, in their own time. Some people spend their whole lives waiting to be chosen by the people who should have chosen them first. I understand that impulse. I lived inside it for a long time. But there comes a point when you have to stop waiting for a seat at a table that was never going to be set for you and start building the table you actually want to sit at. My grandmother built something for me in secret because she understood that some gifts only work if they're given at the right moment. She watched, she planned, she waited, and when the time came, she handed me not a rescue, but a foundation, and trusted me to build on it myself. If this story found you at a moment when someone in your life is making you feel like a guest in your own story, know that the deed to your life has always had your name on it. Sometimes you just have to read the fine print. If this story moved you, leave a comment below. I'd love to know where you're watching from and whether you've ever had to reclaim something that was always yours. Hit like if you believe that quiet strength is still strength. And subscribe if you want more stories about the people who got last word of by barely saying a word at all.